Hi, my name is Dee Saunders, and I'm here to share with you, in layman's terms, my personal journey with genetic colon cancer. Because I'm not a medical professional, everything that I'm sharing with you comes simply from the perspective of a normal person like you might be, without necessarily medical background, and attempting to understand a very complicated medical thing. I know this is sort of a boring way to start off, but we're going to start off with some vocabulary, which I think then will make it easier for me to share my story if you already understand some of these terms. And anytime you see me glancing here off to the left, I just have some notes for myself to help guide this discussion that we're having. So the first thing I want to talk about is colon polyps. What are colon polyps? And basically, your colon is a long tube that runs from your esophagus is the tube that connects your mouth to your stomach. So esophagus, then stomach, and then you have your you have your small intestine, and then you have your large intestine. The small and the large intestine together are called your colon. Your colon is like a vacuum hose. It's just a tube. Polyps are small blister-like things that appear on the wall of the colon. They can become irritated and inflamed, in which case that's called diverticulitis, or they can remain benign and do nothing. But either way, they do impair sometimes the job that your colon is attempting to do. And polyps can be either benign, which is innocent, or precancerous, which is transitioning towards cancer, or cancerous. So if you have colon cancer, chances are it started off as a polyp. So this small blister-like thing on the wall of the colon. A colonoscopy is a procedure where doctors can go in to look at your colon and examine it and look for polyps or any abnormalities or any dysfunctions that are occurring. A colonoscopy involves a 5-foot long hose that is inserted through the rectum and then goes up through the large colon all the way up towards the small intestine. It cannot go into the small intestine. It mainly looks throughout the large intestine and follows the curves and the pathways of that. It has this hose has a camera on it so that it is taking pictures and video the whole time while the doctor is looking, so that he's able to look inside the colon. In order to have this procedure, obviously your colon needs to be cleaned out. So when people talk about having colonoscopies, the procedure itself is not that bad. You're under anesthesia, you are in the hospital, you are normally given an IV, you are sedated, and the hose is inserted, and again, the doctor's looking through all this feet of colon that you possess. But what is much rougher is the day before, which is the preparation for the colonoscopy, in which case your entire colon needs to be emptied out. So that involves not eating for upwards of 24 to 48 hours, and then starting the day before taking a medication that makes your body completely evacuate everything. It is not a fun procedure. There's no getting around that. Things have gotten certainly a lot more advanced through the years. The medications that you have to take are not as disgusting as they used to be 20 years ago. I have a friend who took a colonoscopy by taking one pill. I would love that. I haven't discovered that yet, but I'm on my way to that. So it's certainly not as traumatic as it used to be when they had you drink a gallon of some of the nastiest tasting stuff I've ever experienced. But that day of hell is unfortunately necessary in order to have this procedure and then make sure that you're healthy. An endoscopy, unlike a colonoscopy, which goes up into your colon, an endoscopy goes through your mouth and down into your esophagus and then into the stomach. And this is to examine those areas, the esophagus as well as the stomach. So that's an endoscopy, which does also require sedation because you can't have that hose down you very comfortably while you're awake. Another process is called a sigmoidoscopy. The sigmoid colon is the lowest foot of the colon closest to the rectum. And a sigmoidoscopy does not require sedation, and it does not require hospitalization. It is a much smaller tube, again with a camera on it, called a flex scope, and it goes up just that lower portion of your colon to look for anything. A lot of times that's where most polyps and most abnormalities are occurring, is in that last foot of colon. So that's a sigmoidoscopy or a flex scope. Colon cancer, the gene for colon cancer, at the time that I was diagnosed with it was called HNPCC, hereditary non-polyposis colon cancer. It was a very awkward name, and about maybe 15 years ago or so, it was changed over to the name Lynch Syndrome, Lynch, and I believe it was named after a doctor who had done a lot of the research into matching this gene and inheriting the tendencies towards colon cancer. I'm going to read you something now because I found this particular website so helpful in explaining what exactly it was that doctors discovered, and explaining how this process worked. So I apologize for reading to you, but I just have found this really informative. The MLH1, MSH2, MSH6, and PMS2 genes, so these are 4 different genes, are involved in repairing errors that occur when DNA is copied in preparation for cell division, a process called DNA replication. So your DNA is being replicated as cells are going to divide and grow. Because these genes work together to fix DNA errors. So in other words, as the DNA replicates itself, errors can occur. And these 4 genes are part of repairing those mistakes that occur in the DNA. They are known as mismatch repair genes. So these are the genes that fix that, mismatch repair genes. They fix the DNA that has gotten corrupted, like a computer program. Variants in any of these genes prevent the proper repair of DNA replication errors. So instead of the DNA being repaired, the error is being repeated and repeated and repeated. As the abnormal cells continue to divide, the accumulated errors can lead to uncontrolled cell growth and possibly cancer. Variants in the MLH1 or MSH2 gene tend to lead to a higher risk, 70 to 80%, of developing cancer in a person's lifetime, while variants in the MSH6 or PMS2 gene have a lower risk, 25 to 60% of cancer development. I will tell you, as we go into this process, I was diagnosed with the MLH1 gene, which is the higher cancer rate. The other term I want to share with you before we end this whole vocabulary section, boring, is microsatellite instability, which is the process of we have cells that were healthy, and then we have cells that are transitioning, that are showing DNA errors, that are showing that they need mismatch repair, and the repair isn't happening. That's called microsatellite instability, and it is the final stage. Before then, we get to actual cancer, where the cell growth is not being able to be controlled, and these cancer cells are going to end up taking over. So microsatellite instability is this final transitional stage between something being innocent and benign to something being cancerous. So that's called MSI. Thank you. When I was a child, my mother and my grandmother were quite close. All of these stories that I'm going to be relating to you now about familial cancer all runs through the maternal side of my family. So it is my mother, my mother's mother, my mother's grandmother, and my mother's great-grandmother. So me, mom, grandma, great-grandma, great-great-grandma. My mom and my grandma, when they would spend time together when I was a kid, I was always fascinated by the fact that my grandmother always began some of these visits with who had died. I sort of took it as just sort of a morbid thing that somebody in their 50s or 60s would do. I didn't see anything necessarily wrong with it. I thought it was odd. Who died was not a topic that was ever in our family conversations at any other time except when grandma was around. And then even when she would write letters, because this is the 70s when letter writing still was a thing, almost every letter began with who had recently died, either in the family or in her small town in Noversville, Ohio. And almost always it was cancer. And when she would talk about cancer, she would say very commonly that cancer was in our blood, and that this was something I needed to be aware of. When you're a small kid and somebody's telling you that, that doesn't really have a whole lot of meaning. Cancer's in our blood. I don't know what that means. I don't have blood cancer. I can't see cancer. And so I didn't really necessarily take it to heart or put any meaning behind it until I was 20, at which point my mother was diagnosed with stomach cancer. Within a year, she had passed away. She was only 41. It's a very young age to be dying of a very killer cancer. There are some cancers that are have a much higher fatality rate than others. It depends on the symptoms that they typically show and how advanced those symptoms are before they're noticeable. Stomach cancer is a killer cancer in that by the time you're really feeling symptoms enough that make you go in and pursue this with a doctor to have it heavily looked at, normally the cancer has advanced past a very treatable stage. Stage 1 through 4 of cancer, with 4 being the worst. There are other killer cancers. Pancreatic is a killer cancer, ovarian cancer, but more cancers like breast cancer has a lower chance of fatality just because women tend to notice that there's a lump in their breast before it's gotten very far. Testicular cancer, very low fatality rate. Skin cancers of certain kinds have very low rates because they tend to get noticed. You see it on your skin and you're like, something's wrong. So when my mom died, suddenly these words, "it's in our blood," began to have kind of a whole different level of meaning for me. And as I progressed with that was 1985. As a few years had gone past after that, my grandmother once wrote me a letter where she listed all of the relatives in our family who had cancer or who had died of cancer, including, she told a fascinating story that her own first cancer, and it was colon cancer, was at the age of 28. 28 is an extremely young age to get colon cancer. Colon cancer tends to be an old person's cancer. But more fascinatingly, while she was in the hospital at the age of 28 having her first cancer removed, her mother was in the hospital having her first cancer removed at the age of 48. So this 28 and 48-year-old woman were both being treated for colon cancer at the same time. The colon cancer that my grandmother had was in her appendix, which is a right-sided cancer. This is also kind of a warning sign for Lynch syndrome, as most of these colon cancers tend to be right-sided cancers. I don't know the reasons for that, believe me. She went on, my grandmother went on then to have a second cancer, which was uterine cancer. My great-grandmother, her mother, had 5 colon cancers before she finally passed away, sometime in her 80s. I was old enough to remember my great-grandmother. Her mother had died of colon cancer as well, and my grandmother's brother and sister both had colon cancer, and my grandmother's sister had uterine cancer. So we have this strong, strong link of my mother with stomach, my grandmother with colon and uterine, her sister with colon and uterine, her brother with colon, her mother with 5 colon cancers, and then her mother above that. So the history is very, very strong. And that's when I first became aware that this might be something I do want to actually pay attention to, and I have kept that letter since then. In 1992, I had my first child, and in 1993, I had my second, and suddenly the idea of this being something that could be inherited became a lot more important to me. In 1993, at the age of 29, I had just had my second child, and I went to the doctor because I just felt like something was a little off. I wasn't really feeling quite right. My energy level was a little altered. My bowel habits had completely changed. There were bouts of urgency. There were bouts of diarrhea that weren't explained. There were just things were not regular. I just didn't feel like I was necessarily experiencing my life as I had before. And I went to a doctor, and he was very disparaging of my concerns. Didn't feel like at the age of 29 there was anything to be worried about, even though I had impressed upon him my own family's history of colon cancer. And he was felt like this was probably just young mother syndrome and I needed to get over it. But I really pushed it with him, and to the point that he eventually said, okay, that he would do the flex scope that we talked about earlier, right there in his office. Not pleasant, no anesthesia, no preparation, no nothing, but he goes in there and discovers that I have colon polyps. He's shocked at the age of 29. This is not something that should be happening. So he schedules an actual colonoscopy so that they can go in there, remove them, and we can be starting over fresh from scratch. About 6 months after that, after having that real colonoscopy, I felt the same way all over again. And I went back to him and I had to fight him tooth and nail again to have a colonoscopy because I just felt like something was wrong. And sure, lo and behold, he goes in there and there's more colon polyps, only 6 months after having had the previous scope that removed all of them. After that, I left that doctor. I'm not going to have to be the one who's fighting for my own life all the time. So I got referred to a doctor at OSU who, once they heard my history, were gleeful to send me over to the genetics clinic to begin the process of being diagnosed as possibly having the gene that could lead to a higher and increased risk of colon cancer. As we talked about, I was then eventually diagnosed with the MLH1 gene, but that was a process too. Once I got referred to the genetics clinic, they were very interested in my grandmother, who was still alive, and my mother, who had already passed away. Her tumor, I did not know that doctors do this, but was kept in a tumor block, and they were able to track it down at Toledo Hospital and have it shipped to Columbus to be studied, because in that tumor they would be able to see the presence of the mismatch repair happening and the gene not doing its job. They also wanted my grandmother's blood in order to check her for this altered gene. And so my grandmother had an appointment at the genetics clinic with me, and as I sat there, she did not show up. It was kind of heartbreaking because I, as a young mom, was really interested in pursuing this heartily and making sure that I was okay, and more importantly, that my children would be okay. My grandfather, who was a bit of a bully, had convinced my grandmother that this was not a good idea, that if she got diagnosed with this gene, that then they could be denied insurance coverage for having a pre-existing condition. The challenge with that I could not get him to understand is that she'd already had cancer twice. She already had a pre-existing condition, and they could not deny her coverage from that either. But there was no getting through to him, and so eventually I had to actually drive to her small town one day when he was at work and take her to a doctor's office and have them draw her blood behind his back so that they could ship it to OSU to be studied. It was important to her too, but she wasn't in a position to be strong enough to argue with him, and I couldn't win the argument with him. So we went behind his back, and the genetics department at OSU got her blood as well as my mother's tumor block as well as my blood. From that, I was diagnosed with HNPCC, with the variant being in the MLH1 gene. The implications, as I've mentioned, are not just for me, but for my children. It means that they have a 50% chance of inheriting this higher risk for colon cancer. I will say that my first two children, the ones born in 92 and 93, do both have this altered gene. My youngest son, the third child, does not. He considers himself very fortunate. The cancers that are involved in this family of cancers include colon cancer, gastrointestinal cancer, which can include the esophagus, the stomach, the lower intestine, the small intestine, all that process. The appendix and right-sided cancers, which is a whole indicator of Lynch, having an appendix cancer or a right-sided cancer. For some reason, I'm not clear on why that occurs. Endometrial cancer, which is the lining of the uterus, uterine cancer, ovarian cancer, pancreatic cancer, and skin cancer are all cancers that are part of this Lynch syndrome, all with different varying degrees of potential risk involved in them. Once I got diagnosed, then what begins is this extensive screening process. So for me, a normal medical year involves a colonoscopy and the prep for that, as well as an endoscopy, so they're going up and down, looking at everything. It involves a pap smear, so looking at the cervix, looking at the uterus. It involved, they recommend having a hysterectomy for women once they are past childbearing years, once you know that you're done having children. If you have all of that taken out, those are organs that can't get cancer. So take out the uterus, then you can't get uterine cancer anymore, as well as the ovaries and all of that. Dermatology, that screening, that's a blast. It involves once a year getting buck-ass naked for a doctor to literally inspect you from head to toe. And I'm talking looking underneath your hair, I'm talking looking between your toes, looking for any sort of abnormalities anywhere and checking for those. They also recommend pancreatic studies. I was sort of oddly fortunate that about 2010, I'd had something else wrong, that I had an MRI. And when they looked at the MRI, they found cysts in my pancreas. So those cysts required studying. They determined that they were benign and that they were innocent, but that they required studying and monitoring. So yearly, I am approved for an MRI to look at my pancreas and to make sure that these cysts have not changed within the past year. And in 14 years, they haven't budged, they haven't changed. And that MRI is covered by insurance for this reason. Normally, people can't just walk in and have a pancreatic MRI, but because of these cysts, I've been able to get the kind of monitoring, so I feel much more secure in knowing that chances are pretty good. It'll be difficult for me to get diagnosed with pancreatic cancer because we'll catch it so early. In 1999, I had my regular routine colonoscopy, had polyps removed like I normally do, and then scheduled my next colonoscopy for the year 2000. In 2000, I became pregnant with my third child, and so when I went to have the colonoscopy, they said, let's not do this. We just had a scope a year ago, you should be fine. Don't want you and the baby to have to undergo anesthesia, don't want to put stress on your body by doing the prep, so we'll just postpone, which was fine. Then I had my child at the end of 2000, and then I became sick after that. Unfortunately, I developed what's called necrotizing fasciitis, or flesh-eating bacteria, which is a story for another day. But anyways, it took several months to recover from that. By the time I recovered and then called to schedule a colonoscopy, which has its own waiting period, it had been well over 2 years since I had last had a colonoscopy. And when I went in, the doctors discovered what up until then was the largest polyp I had ever had. And it was in this last stage called microsatellite instability that we talked about earlier in the vocabulary. It was in the transitional stage to colon cancer. It had not yet become cancerous, but it was showing all the beginning signs of doing that mismatch repair in the DNA, and so therefore needed to be treated. So it was removed, and my colon was actually tattooed. My first ever tattoo was in my colon, so that every time they would go in then to do another exam, they knew that that was a hot spot they needed to be following and paying attention to. Since then, no polyp has appeared on that spot, so I've been very fortunate, but I always think it's odd that I'm walking around with a tattoo on my colon on the inside that nobody else can see. Some other interesting parts of maintaining this kind of screening and everything that I need to go through. As I mentioned before, that I have to see a dermatologist. I have been diagnosed with several basal cell carcinomas. Now, basal cell carcinoma is a very innocent cancer, if there's such a thing as an innocent cancer. It just has a very, very low fatality rate. It is usually caused just by sun and living a life that's not always under sun protection and sunscreen. I taught marching band for years and years, as well as participated in it, so I spent all of my summers and fall burnt brown, and finally eventually paid the price for that. I've had 3 different basal cell carcinomas removed, all of which are not necessarily linked to the Lynch. If left untreated, they will indeed become cancerous and could eventually, they already are cancer, I apologize. They could become more fatal and eventually kill you, but it would require years of going untreated for a basal cell to have that kind of effect. Eventually, I was diagnosed with one on my back called a sebaceous adenoma. I'm always one to try to understand what is happening. So when I looked up sebaceous adenoma, it said this could be a concern and a precursor, a warning that you have Muir-Torre syndrome, Muir-Torre. So I panicked and I started looking up Muir-Torre syndrome, only to find out that Muir-Torre syndrome says, if you have Muir-Torre syndrome, it could be a warning that you have Lynch syndrome. Well, having already been diagnosed with Lynch syndrome, this was just sort of a circular logical thing. So certainly the sebaceous adenoma, that was a warning that my Lynch syndrome was at work on my skin. So again, I remain very vigilant about my dermatological screenings. In 1998, I had an appendectomy simply for the purpose of removing my appendix. Again, another organ removed that you can't get cancer in then. Some other interesting procedures I've had one where you actually swallow a camera. As I said, a colonoscopy looks at your large intestine, and endoscopy looks at your esophagus and your stomach. None of these look at your small intestine. By swallowing this camera, you go into the hospital in the morning, they hand you this camera. It really was the size of maybe a little bit bigger than a Hershey's Kiss, and you swallow that. There's a camera in it, and as it travels through your digestive system, it's constantly taking pictures and video. You wear a camera pack on your waist, and it transmits that picture and those video all day long while the camera travels through you. I never saw it come out. For all I know, it's still in there, and I never could see it. But at the end of the day, you go back to the hospital and you hand them the camera pack, and they can look at everything and actually see everything inside of you. Now, again, you have to do a prep, just like a colonoscopy, in order for that to be effective, because you have to have a cleaned out colon so they could see everything. But that does enable them to see the small intestine that normally they don't have any way of seeing. So that one was interesting. And I had a full day teaching school wearing that camera pack and explaining to the kids what was happening, that this thing was taking pictures all day of me. So for me, Lynch syndrome it's not a death sentence. There is a gene you may have heard of called BRCA, which is the breast cancer gene. It's sort of the same thing. It runs in families. That's a scary diagnosis, in that the breast cancer that goes along with the BRCA gene is very aggressive and tends to be a killer cancer. There are famous people who have this gene. Notably, I believe Angelina Jolie chose to have an optional double mastectomy. In other words, just let's remove these so that this is another organ that I can't get cancer in. That's a very radical choice, but one that I certainly understand, as she's a mother and wanted to spare her children her potential death. I just think it requires a level of diligence, of maintenance. It requires me, there's nobody telling me to schedule these doctor's appointments, so I have to stay on top of it. I have to do the research, see what new things, what new tests I should be having, and just, again, paying attention. I also do enjoy the opportunity to educate other people about it. Perhaps you look at your own family and say, hey, maybe we should be talking about this. There are certain aspects of Lynch syndrome and its various cancers too that are, again, not a death sentence, in that although people who have Lynch syndrome and who get any of these cancers, they tend to come young. So my grandmother's 28 is not necessarily a huge abnormality in a Lynch syndrome diagnosis. But they also tend to be less aggressive cancers. So our fatality rate of cancer is lower than perhaps the general population, which is interesting. So we have young, onset of cancer, but we have a lesser fatality rate. Now, whether or not that's actually the cancer itself, or because, like me, these are people who are in tune with their bodies and having to pay attention and quicker maybe to react and get into the doctor's office, and so getting lower stages of diagnosis, I don't know. And then they don't really know, but they do tend to be less fatal than some of the cancers out in the general public. But our incident rate of getting it is so much incredibly higher. So it is my job to maintain, to go through the screenings, to make sure that I'm paying attention, to be preventative, and to educate others so that maybe they can go through the same thing. My daughter, who was raised here in Columbus and has always seen my same doctors because she has the gene, has moved up into the Michigan area and has an even better situation at U of M, where they are very diligent with screenings and have her set up with a whole team of doctors where they make sure she's coming in. I kind of actually sort of envy the situation that she's in. So again, not a death sentence, but just such an important thing to know for your family and to be paying attention to. So if you have anything in your family that leads you to believe that maybe this is something you guys should be looking at, feel free to contact the genetics clinic at Ohio State University. They are top of the game, and I highly recommend it. Thanks.